I'll try to talk about how we've sought in this work to operationalize the pathways approach in a particular very specific context. What we were trying to do was to look at the issue of maize and what we were calling maize innovation pathways in an African context, to look at how maize is such a critical crop to people's well-being, livelihoods, to questions about sustainability and resilience in this setting. And so we use that maize as a window in to a whole set of debates about dynamic change, environmental terms and social terms and technological terms, and to try to understand what we were calling maize innovation systems in the context of Kenya. Maize is important, and for those of you, how many people work or have worked in Africa? Many. How many of you worked around the food and agriculture domain broadly? Also many. So some of this is going to be familiar to you, but maize is a critically important crop to people's well-being in that part of the world. Affects, or is a kind of critical staple to over 300 million people. But what we've seen is persistent, recurrent droughts in many parts of the region that have affected the performance of the crop to be able to withstand a certain amount of stress from uncertain rainfall events and climate change concerns. And the predictions going forward for many parts of sub-Saharan Africa is that climate change is going to have a negative effect on the performance of staple crops like maize across the region. Now, it's interesting, some recent climate models are suggesting things might improve in terms of rainfall patterns in Eastern Africa, but the uncertainty has grown, so we don't know in those circumstances. But one of the claims coming from some people working around the food security and maize agenda in the region is that by developing, distributing, and cultivating new, what are called drought-tolerant varieties of maize, that will be able to reduce food insecurity, vulnerability, and improve people's well-being in the region. So new technological fixes, as it were, to solve some of the food security challenges in that part of the world. The counterclaim to that is, in fact, that some of these innovations will, in fact, lead to a lock-in of farmers to an over-reliance on certain technologies, on certain food crops, that may actually lead to greater insecurity in the long term as shocks and stresses occur there. And as Ian talked about, that notion of lock-in or path dependence is a concern when people get connected to particular technological trajectories or innovation pathways. With our Kenyan project, we were trying to trace some of these innovation pathways in maize and in some other crops I'll describe, and look at the responses of different actors to some of the rapid social, technological, environmental changes that we see in that part of the world related to agricultural production practices. So we tried to examine ways in which different actors in different settings, and we looked at low potential, medium potential, and higher potential zones of cultivation across Kenya as we did this work, to try to understand and see how people frame that notion of resilience, which we were just talking about a moment ago, and the resilience to that growing uncertainty in those processes of dynamic change, and particularly related to increasing climate variability and other shifts. And we also sought to look at how these framings by those different actors were shaping the agricultural research and development and food policy agendas at national level and even regional level to some extent, and how those framings and perspectives were then influencing the kind of investments, the kind of innovations that were being supported and leading trajectories in particular directions. Coming back to that notion of resilience and thinking about how it's framed in different ways, we recognized when we were looking through that maize window that some people were focusing very much on the seed. We're looking at germplasm and saying we can breed new varieties of drought-tolerant crops, including maize, new open pollinated varieties that we can offer to farmers in different settings, new hybrid varieties that will help them to withstand these stresses coming from that climate variability. So let's focus on improving seed varieties, those new drought-tolerant varieties. So that was their focus in terms of investment, research, and development. Others were saying, well, actually, no. Seeds are important, but we have to look at the whole farming system to understand some of those dynamic changes and understand both in the higher input and the lower input systems how resilience can be strengthened and how different inputs can be provided through both public systems and private systems there to make those new technologies available. Others were saying, well, wait a second. People are straddling a whole set of livelihood strategies, both on-farm and off-farm. We have to understand the broader livelihood system if we're really thinking about resilience, recognizing that people are diversifying out of agriculture in many cases so that they can become more resilient, more able to withstand some of the stresses. We need to think much more about not just the input side, but the output side, thinking in terms of a value chain approach across the whole system to look at how those livelihoods can be strengthened. And others were saying, well, we actually have to think about the national level, to think about national food security and issues around the resilience of the national system to withstand some of the stresses that are happening at quite a large scale. And that means looking at programs and policies and strategies. So different people are intervening at different levels of the system, at different scales, bringing new perspectives on the use of technology, its application in different contexts, promoting certain policies, certain priorities being put forward for investment in those locations. But all of them are arguing that their approach is going to improve people and the national ability to withstand those shocks and stresses in those contexts. Now, we had two main phases in this research. The first was trying to understand this question of why maize? Why are so many people dependent on a single crop? And understanding that lock-in to a dominant maize pathway was important for just revealing what alternatives exist or might exist that we might help people to open up and broaden out, to use some of the language we heard earlier. And we wanted to think about those notions of resilience and resilience at different scales for both the higher potential zones, the kind of breadbasket areas where people are using hybrid varieties, intensifying, commercializing their agricultural production practices, where those regions contribute to national food security in various ways because they may be surplus producing areas. And then the low potential areas where people are living at the very edge in some cases, where context matters in terms of people's ability to respond to those shocks and stresses. And we recognize that policies and practices were happening in parallel universes, that you had these formal systems and the informal systems often overlapping in the same locations, that many farmers rely on informal systems to get access to their seed. They're trading them in the marketplace, but not with the state involvement at all, or through different sorts of social networks. And for many, even in the maize system, which is very formalized in the case of Kenya, much more so than other parts of eastern and southern Africa, even there, a lot of maize is traded through those informal systems. So we had to understand how you had a small but quite robustly managed and regulated formal sector that was delivering new varieties of maize and other crops, a narrow basket of crops, to farmers, but you had a much bigger informal sector which provided the bulk of people's seeds and provided a whole set of support in terms of knowledge, advice to those people. So we started thinking about this notion of integrated seed sector development, and perhaps over the next week I'll be able to tell you more about some of that thinking, because we've developed a new program going forward around that idea. But for now, I'll talk about the second phase, And the aim was first understanding, as I described, those pathways in and out of maize a bit, and identifying a number of different pathways that might exist, and to see how we could use climate change not to focus on the negative necessarily, but as an opportunity to rethink the maize system and the wider food system in the country, to open up a debate about alternatives, and to encourage a shift from a narrow focus on maize research and development to be thinking about a broader ag-food innovation systems perspective and the policies that would be supported, need to be supported around that. So we started talking about pathways in and out of maize to recognize, as I say, maize is the dominant crop. It's important to people's well-being. Those of you who've worked in that part of the world will know that some ethnic groups equate maize with food. And when they talk about maize security, they're talking about food security in one and the same breath. When people are referring to one, they connect it to the other. So it's a critically important crop, and there's no doubt about its continuing importance going forward, but perhaps not to the exclusion of all else. So as we started to analyze through a set of rapid assessment processes and surveys that we'd done and key informant interviews, we started to identify what we were describing as 9 core pathways in and out of maize, particularly for the risk-prone, diverse, low potential zones where many people rely on maize, but maize doesn't do particularly well in those environments. So you have this contradiction of people wanting more maize in an environment where it doesn't really perform. So we looked at 3 dimensions of these pathways. The first was resilience to internal and external inputs. How much did they have to get stuff from outside? Not just the seeds, but the fertilizer, the pesticides, perhaps the other kinds of technologies they needed to support their production, and sources of information through formal and informal channels. We looked at their reliance on maize as a crop. How important is maize as a central feature in their food security and livelihood strategy? And we looked at the diversification out of maize. Many were struggling to move beyond maize, to think about alternatives to it, but those pathways weren't necessarily being supported by research, by investment, by technical support coming from the state or NGOs. So they may have an inkling that they would like to pursue something, but it's not always that easy to achieve. And I'll talk more about that. So we essentially came up with a simple typology of pathways, looking at low maize, high maize dependence on one axis, and low external input, high external input. And then we mapped onto there these axes, a set of pathways, some dealing with alternative dryland staple crops for subsistence, some of those crops that could be grown for the marketplace, some where you had assisted seed multiplication to produce those varieties locally and distribute them so you didn't have to rely on commercial suppliers in those areas, where you looked at improvement of local varieties of maize, which are often preferred by farmers, but don't necessarily give you high yields, but they work in those contexts. And then looked at the assisted multiplication of those varieties in those locations. And then we looked at higher value commercialization crops, such as horticultural crops, which I'll talk more about, and looked at how they could be grown by individual producers or by groups of producers working together in some sort of association or cooperative in some way, and how that might be an alternative to maize. And then looked at some commercial delivery of new varieties of drought-tolerant maize that are being promoted and were being encouraged as a way ahead. So staying with maize, but new varieties that might be able to withstand some of the shocks and stresses. And those could be delivered either through commercial suppliers or the public sector. So we used that as a way into a broader discussion with a range of actors, farmers and others, and looked at the range of pathways, analyzing those in and out of maize, looked at then the criteria that people will use for making judgments about those different pathways. So we didn't bring our criteria to assess the strengths and weaknesses of these, the trade-offs across these different pathways, but we asked the various stakeholder groups that we engaged with to try to tell us what they thought their preferred criteria were to help for selecting first one pathway and then comparing those against the others. And then we use that discussion to help think about alternative visions of policy and institutional arrangements that would be needed to support and strengthen these different pathways, both the dominant maize ones and the alternatives out of maize. And to help us do this process of criteria analysis, we used an approach called multi-criteria mapping, which I won't be talking about now, but we will be talking about on Friday, as a way to first elicit the criteria and then to work with those different stakeholder groups to apply their own criteria to the assessment of the different pathways. And here are some very rapid results from the findings of this work. First, we were looking at some of the pathways out of maize, looking at whether some of these alternative dryland crops such as sorghum, millet, cassava might be better for those complex, diverse, risk-prone environments. So we could think of these traditional crops being used, because many of them have been grown for decades, for generations, but have been put aside in some context in favor of maize. And so now the option would be to bring those back into the center of an agricultural system and see how they work in these new contexts to help people, particularly at a time when climate change is becoming more and more of a concern. So rather than think of them as what's sometimes called orphan crops, we can see them as siblings, as complementary crops to the maize crops that are grown. But what we found is people were saying it's not just about taste, because what's happened is people are now preferring maize as the core staple in their diets, but it's also about market opportunities, the demand, and stimulating demand for those orphan crops or sibling crops to be grown. So the challenge is how we overcome some of those market barriers and create new opportunities in different contexts for farmers. A second pathway out of maize is thinking about some of those high-risk, high-value crops I mentioned, the horticultural crops, things like citrus and mango and other crops that might be beneficial. Many of these are crops that farmers haven't traditionally grown, but the problem is that they have a lot of the same constraints that farmers in those places have faced for a long time. Access to water, the cost of inputs, post-harvest storage. All of those are challenges for poor farmers in many risk-prone environments. So there's plenty of potential of those crops, but also a lot of uncertainty. And we need to understand that. So the challenges for these pathways is to think about how you reduce risk, how you can come up with drought-tolerant trees that work in those contexts, how farmers can organize themselves to cooperate, to compete in a very competitive environment, perhaps by organizing group-based production and marketing of those crops. What we found in many of these cases for horticulture is water is a real deal breaker. If people don't have reliable access to water in various forms at critical points in the season, they're in trouble. And so that's what I say, it's high risk, but also high value, but also high risk. And so it's how we help people to deal with some of those risks, particularly water-based concerns. In terms of pathways within maize, we can see that I mentioned we're living in parallel universes. We've got both the informal seed sector and the formal seed sector. And here we see that informal seeds should be seen as not just a last resort. They deliver varieties on a regular basis to large number of farmers, so don't downplay them. Don't see them as a problem, as a bottleneck, but actually let's see how we can invest in them to strengthen them, perhaps by building, strengthening farmers to produce, through assisted seed multiplication, more and higher quality seed. What's called quality assured seed. It's not certified, it hasn't gone through the formal regulatory system, but it has some level of quality assurance about it, so when farmers purchase it or obtain it through different channels, that when they plant it, they can be assured they'll get something out of the ground. That means thinking about quality control, continuity of supply. So as I say, there's opportunity for us to think about integrated seed sector development as part of the approach that could be taken at a policy level for widening the basket. It's still maize related, but it diversifies the array of options that are available to those producers. And then the last one is looking at climate change as an opportunity within maize, of seeing that maize in the system plays multiple roles in different circumstances. We can think beyond the lock-in, that maize security always equals food security. No, it doesn't, but it's a critical part of the basket. And we need to understand that. We need to understand the importance of markets, both the input markets for delivering those varieties and the output markets to create that effective pull, that demand for those varieties in the system. So we can think in terms of resilience through diversity in this context. The opportunities are many, but so are the constraints, and we need to be aware of those. So in summary, we're talking about new drought-tolerant maize being critically important to people's well-being going forward in this part of the world. But also, it's only one of many possible pathways. We need to recognize that. We need to think about how we identify, open up, broaden out the array of pathways that exist. To recognize farmer preferences for local maize. This is what people, when we contacted or interviewed farmers in many different contexts, they all preferred, first and foremost, their local varieties. So how do we get more of that, of a higher quality, to them on a regular basis? But also thinking about the dryland staples that they could diversify into, and equally some of the horticulture, particularly the tree crops, for being able to, helping them to withstand some of those stresses from climate uncertainty and so on. We need to think about income levels and risk of resource-poor farmers being less willing to invest, not surprisingly, in those uncertain, those risky pathways, like the high-value but high-risk horticultural pathways. They're going to need support in training and technical advice, in the technologies that they use, in the market opportunities. So if they're going to diversify out of maize into other things, assistance is going to be required from the state, from NGOs, from private actors. We need to think about the role of the groups in helping people to organize, respond, to cooperate, to compete, as I mentioned, sharing knowledge and skills, thinking about the resources and risks and how they can manage those together, how that can strengthen the resilience of those producers. We need to think about assisted seed multiplication in the settings where we see that by getting more seed produced locally and distributed locally, that we called it a consistent performer from the multi-criteria mapping work that we did. People saw that as a good way forward. It wasn't an expensive process. It did require training, technical support, but it could lead to a real multiplier effect. But there was a need for training and support to make that happen. And to conclude, what we see as we did this analysis is that there are more pathways than the dominant maize pathway that exists at the moment. There are multiple ones that can work under different conditions. No one size fits all, not surprisingly, but many of them were still constrained, still limited because of the lack of research support, because of the lack of investment, because of the lack of policy assistance to really allow those to open up and flourish. So there was a lot more to be done, but a lot of potential to be had. So I'm just going to show you very quickly a short video. It's also on the STEPS website.
Kwa hivyo mahindi na faida nyingi kwetu, sababu huwa na mahindi unakuwa unatapiga. Kwa hivyo hiyo mbegu nzuri ya mahindi inakufanya next season uwe na mbegu nzuri.
In the subsistence farming and in semi-arid areas, 90% of the population rely on the informal seed system. In the high potential areas that receive moderately better rainfall, the farmers will assess their seed through the formal seed system. And basically, like for maize, they will get hybrid seed. Seed produced by seed companies, and after farmer plants, farmer cannot use that seed again to plant, but has to go back to the stockists and buy a fresh seed supply.
The formal system is very important in seed production in that it's a sure way of starting off with quality planting material, and it's a sure way of reducing risks of failure. And in this kind of environment, this tropical environment, there are so many obstacles to achieving high yield. The international institutions play a big role in shaping the seed policy in the country, in that we are trading with them. So some of the standards set in the international world affect us.
The multinational companies, they have been influencing even the making of the policies. They have been influencing the making of the regulations. And as a result, I think this country has more or less gone towards the formal seed sector, but they have virtually ignored the informal seed sector, which produces most of the seed that we use.
It is important that we support the informal seed sector to drive in the direction of having that farming activity as a business. And the only way of doing that is by having quality seed available to them. Otherwise, by maintaining informal seed system, we are maintaining subsistence farming.
The future of the seed sector, particularly here in Kenya, I think lies in where they have got to integrate both the informal seed sector together with the formal seed sector, and be able to initiate the production of the standard seed, which will then be able to actually stimulate the production towards the formal seed sector.
Tutakuwa tu tuko na hizi mbegu zetu. Kama tungepata wasaidizi, ungeona watu wengi, ama tungepata wasaidizi tukafundisha watu kuhifadhi hizi mbegu. Hizi mbegu ya mahindi huwezi ikaisha kwa watu wetu.